It's good to be with you today. Please join me in the spirit of prayer. God of love and compassion, may the words from our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and redeemer. Amen. Around 20 years ago, my husband and I really were struggling in our relationship, and we spent a long time in therapy. On one of our very last sessions with the therapist, he said to us, "I have given you all the tools that I have. Now you have to choose to use them." Today's gospel lesson is one of several final words of discourse or tools that Jesus gave that he shared with his disciples. It's a call to abide, to love one another, to be joyful, to follow his commandments, and a call to friendship. It's about how to live our lives. I'll be reading from the book of John, chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. "I've loved you the way my Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done, kept my Father's commands, and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. You are my friends when you do the things I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants, because servants don't understand what their master is thinking and planning. No, I've named you friends, because I've let you in on everything I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me, remember. I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another." Thanks be to God for this morning's gospel lesson on lessons of love. I read a blog post that said, in light of continued world wars, school shootings, cancer, suicide, poverty, discrimination, broken relationships, abuse, injustice, anxiety, spite, and sorrow. Some days it's just too heavy for my heart. Well, with all of these whatevers that I've just listed, and they're happening in all of our lives in some way, some of them anyway, we need reminders that joy and love are choices in light of and despite whatever we're going through. Now, this story that I'm going to share with you is one that could really have been my own story, but it's not. It's one from a marriage counselor about one of his clients. This woman came into his office and she was outraged. She had just had it with her relationship with her husband. But she wanted a divorce, she wanted to end the marriage, and she wanted revenge on this guy. Well, the counselor was silent for a little while, and then he came up with a plan for this woman. He told her for the next 2 to 3 months she was to go home and pretend that she was still in love with her husband, shower him with compliments, and do little favors here and there. Then at the appointed moment, when the time came, she would drop the bomb on him. "I'm done with you, I'm leaving this marriage, I'm divorcing you." And then she'd have her sweet revenge. Well, the woman told the counselor that she liked the final outcome, but she wasn't so sure that she could go through with being nice to him for the next couple of weeks. But she didn't have any alternatives, so she decided to go home and try it. Well, 2.5 months went by, and the counselor never heard from her again, so he called her to see how things were going. He asked if she was ready for her divorce, and she said, "What are you talking about? After all the kindness and love that we've shared toward each other for the past 10 weeks, we are happier than we have ever been. There will be no divorce." and I thank you. I can only imagine that the therapist knew exactly what he was doing, bringing intentional joy and love back into that relationship. Another favorite story of mine is about a beloved that many of you know from your past, Fred Rogers, good old Mr. Rogers that brought us all into the neighborhood and told us what a wonderful day it was. Well, I considered stopping right here as I talked about Fred Rogers and buttoning up my cardigan and putting on a pair of pants, but I didn't think I needed to go with that. And Fred Rogers really had an innate joy for life and love for all people, especially one of his persons that was on the show with him, Francois Clemens, who I'll tell you about in just a little bit. But I didn't realize until last year that Fred Rogers was an ordained Presbyterian minister, which really makes sense for the way he was on his show. But he credited the success of his show not just to himself, yet with those that he shared it with: the chef who walked with a limp, a handyman who loved jazz, the speedy courier who talked so fast as he delivered, and even the police officer who sings opera. Well, over the course of 31 years, Mr. Rogers used his neighborhood to show the world as it should be, a microcosm of kindness where neighbors love and support each other through difficult times of death, of divorce, and danger. It was also a space where Mr. Rogers helped viewers confront their own fear and prejudices, leading them past them in his own non-threatening way. From the beginning, Rogers specifically challenged the nation's understanding of race through his friendship, both on and off screen, with Francois Clemens, the neighborhood police officer who just happened to be an African American. When Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood first aired in 1968 on public TV, American viewers were desperate for some good news. The previous decade had brought political assassinations and the threat of Cold War, the sexual revolution, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. These conflicts and threats were present in everyone's life. And at least the children, perhaps some of the time, and maybe even their family, got some of the joy and love that came from watching Mr. Rogers. At the time, Francois Clemens was pursuing a career as an opera star, as an opera singer, and he was touring when Rogers heard him perform at his home church in Pittsburgh. Soon after hearing him, Rogers invited Clemens to appear in the neighborhood as a police officer. And this is what he said. He said, Fred came to me saying, "I have this idea. You could be a police officer." Well, that kind of stopped him right there because he grew up in the ghetto and he did not have a positive opinion of police officers. He said policemen were sicking police dogs and water hoses on black people, and he really had a hard time putting himself in that position. So he wasn't real excited about being Officer Clemens at all. But Rogers prevailed, and Clemens joined Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in August of 1968. And that was only 4 months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And by doing that, Clemens became the first African American with a recurring role on a children's television series. But as progressive as this was, Rogers decided to press social convention even further. Some of you may have heard this, and I love this part. In episode 1065, which aired only a few months after Clemens debuted, he opens in the typical manner, with Rogers inviting viewers to be his neighbor, but instead of putting on his iconic cardigan, Rogers walked over, said it was how hot the day was, and he walked over to put his feet in his nice little cool wading pool that he had over on the side. And he begins to soak his feet. Soon, Officer Clemens stops by for a visit, and Mr. Rogers invites him to share the pool with him. Clemens quickly accepts and rolls up his pant legs of his uniform and places his very brown feet in the same water as Rogers' very white feet. Well, today, this small gesture may seem very insignificant, but at the time, it was huge. Like public water fountains, public transportation, and public schools, the public pool had become a battleground of racial segregation. Under Jim Crow era policy, not only could blacks and whites not swim at the same time, many pools were entirely off limits to blacks. And like the lunch counter in public buses, swimming pools had become a place and point of protest. But here in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, only 5 years later, this quiet Presbyterian minister and this African-American police officer show the world how to integrate swimming pools. Rogers invites, Clemens accepts, and as Clemens slips his feet into the pool, the camera holds the shot for several extra seconds, just to make the point clear that a pair of brown feet and a pair of white feet can share a swimming pool. Moving forward 25 years into the show, Rogers and Clemens reenacted the moment. A much older Rogers and Clemens sit with their feet in a similar little blue wading pool, talking about the many different ways that children and adults say "I love you" to each other. And as the scene ends, Mr. Rogers takes a towel and he helps Clemens dry his feet with the simple saying, "Here, let me help you." It's no surprise then that when this Presbyterian minister wanted to heal the divide between blacks and whites, to show us how to serve each other, it looked very much like Jesus' own servanthood of foot washing. Yet both acts required humility. Both acts required relinquishing privilege. The privilege of anger on Clemens' part, and the privilege of comfort on Rogers' part. And through this humanity, both men embody love, neither condescending to the other, both simply surrendering to the other, so that in the very same act, the humiliated are brought up and the proud are brought down. Well, the theme of this story is really about loving all people, but Clemens also happened to be gay. And while Fred Rogers was not a public advocate for gay rights at the time, he feared making a statement at the time would discriminate viewers, and he would lose a lot of kids who needed to hear his message. But his message of unconditional acceptance rang true for viewers of all genders, orientations, and races. And he meant it. On Clemens' very last appearance on The Neighborhood, Rogers wrapped up the episode with his final closing statement that he always made. He said, "You make every day a special day just by being you, and I like you just the way you are." Well, Clemens noticed that Rogers looked directly at him when he was saying it. So when the episode ended, Clemens went up to him and said, "Fred, were you talking to me?" And he said, "Yes, I've been talking to you for years, and you just heard me today." Clemens later said that that was one of the most powerful moments in his life. Sometimes we do need repetition in our lives. In the scripture that we heard today, it used the word love 9 times. Is that a repetition that we need to hear how much we are loved and how important it is to love? We are all invited to choose the tools of loving one another by affirming diversity, by promoting healthy relationships in families and communities, by being kind, by being a creatively caring human being. Isn't that a wonderful statement? A creatively caring human being. We could also add on our entire mission statement that we're talking about is on our bulletin, but I don't need to read through all of those because you can read those later. But those are also statements of love, how we can be love in the world. I was going to close here, but I just want to share for 1 minute about my father's passing. He had a tragic accident earlier in the week, and he was left paralyzed. And so as the week passed, it was my family all came together, and we all got to be with my father, and it was a lovely time. And I had sisters who were holding out for the miracle. And I think the miracle was seeing God at work during the entire week, bringing our family together. The doctors and the nurses at the hospital were wonderful. And even to the call that I got in the middle of the night that said that my father was not going to make it through the night, the doctor was so kind. And when I got there, she came over. I sat down next to my father and was holding his hand, and she put her hand on my shoulder and stood there. Doctors don't do that. That generally doesn't happen. But there was so much love in the room. We sang to my father and we prayed to my father, and then remembered that he was a very patriotic man. So we started to sing patriotic songs, and his lips started moving. He was trying to sing with us. And although 3 of his limbs were totally paralyzed, his left arm was moving a little bit. And I said, you know what, let's say the Pledge of Allegiance. He taught my kids to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And we all stood there with our hands on our hearts, and his hand that could move, he was trying to put his hand on his heart, and joined us in his own way of saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So we very lovingly brought my father to the end of his life, and it was a wonderful time together as our family. And even at the end, the doctor came back in, and she hugged each one of us. It was really very beautiful and a very special time. And God certainly had his hand in the entire time that we were all together. I would like to still close with a quote that I have from Mr. Rogers. He said, "When I say it's you that I like, I'm talking about that part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for all those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, justice that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. May it be so. Amen."